So welcome and thank you for your patience. I'm really excited to be here. I think I'm going to learn an awful lot because I don't come from a finance background. And I think we have some amazing experts here with us today. I think we are just setting up the slides. And I want to introduce our panelists. So we have João, who's an economist at the Brazilian Development Bank and a researcher at the New School for Social Research. He holds a PhD in economics with an emphasis on green economic policies and climate finance. And he's been working for over 15 years with sustainable development policy and is doing research on climate economics. He's also affiliated with the Brazilian Development Bank. Is that right? Have I missed anything? Great. And Rodolphe, where are you? Yeah. Ah, there you are. Sorry. He's the VP Partnerships and Regulation at Clarity AI, with over 20 years of experience in the field of environmental finance and sustainable investment. He was the co-founder and CEO of Beyond Ratings, the first credit rating agency to integrate sustainability drivers into sovereign credit worthiness in a systematic and transparent manner. He's a member of the EFRAG, which is...
Right.
Yes.
Right. It's everybody to do your presentation.
Great. Expert working group on the upcoming Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive, and he previously served in the UNPRI Fixed Income Advisory Committee and in the LuxFlag's Green Label Eligibility Committee. He's undertaken several assignments as individual experts for the PRI, the World Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank. And Takhmina, am I saying this right? Takhmina, I apologize, is currently head of development and projects in a fast-growing Swiss commodity and fintech DLT organization, which is AGO. It's all these acronyms. She holds a master's degree in European and International Governance from the University of Geneva and a bachelor's degree in International Affairs from the University of George Washington University. She's experienced in policy research and strategic development with a demonstrated history of working with nonprofit organizations, think tanks, and international institutions, conducting research on financial impact, strategic innovation, and enhancement of economic well-being and youth education. She's a special interest in youth education, actually, fintech innovations, community service, and international digital governance. And Marianne Haahr, who's joining us from online. Very happy to have you here, Marianne. She's the nature-related finance lead of the global Canopy, working on open source nature-related data models and tools. And she's contacted the Secretariat of Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, leading on sector-specific guidance. She served as a member of the informal technical expert group to the task force, shaping its mandate, and she was previously the lead of the executive director of the Green Digital Finance Alliance, and developed a massive number of input papers to the G20 on tech-enabled ESG approaches. So while we're waiting for this, I just wanted to briefly introduce the Green Digital Finance Alliance, which was established in 2017 by at the World Economic Forum by Ant Financial and the UNEP. And basically, we're serving as a bridge and a catalyst for next generation digital finance. And we're focusing on co-creating a global ecosystem of international agencies, philanthropic organizations, corporate actors, global thought leadership, which Marianne has led out expertly over the last few years, open tools and frameworks, and market-led demonstrations. And of those, I've selected a few here that I think are very relevant, and you will see those online. And in the next slide, I've also added some extra resources that I think will be useful. I started my journey into natural capital when I was still at Climate Kick over 7 years ago, and working on blockchain for natural capital, and did a series of pilots with the World Bank, carbon markets pilots, and a number of startups working on value chain and supply chain valuation. So that is enough from me. I think now we'd like to move to our first speaker and hear from him, if we have the slides now.
So thank you. Good afternoon, you all. What I bring today is a discussion that we've been having in our research group in the US, and with research also with the World Bank and here the ILO Green Economic Policy and Finance. But the idea is to bring the current status of green economic policy instruments, but also challenge for natural capital intensive projects. And it's not a coincidence that I have here in the first slide a picture of wind and solar energy plants, because the challenge here that I'd like to bring is like how to move from an energy-based climate policy to a more broader one. Yeah, thank you. So a little bit of the context regarding first fiscal policy, because we know, and it's in the news, and the climate research shows that the use of fiscal instruments has grown in the past few years, especially because of green bonds and carbon price initiatives, carbon taxation, and also ETS. And it's of course super important. And with this effort, we see that renewable energy investment has also increased, together with, of course, innovation and new technologies that decrease the costs. In our research, we show that there are advantages of using green bonds, like protecting from market volatilities, and there are also accessing lower investment costs, capital costs, but also benefits of the integration of carbon pricing and green bonds. However, the first point that I would like to share is that green bonds first are mainly used for energy projects, clean transport projects of infrastructure, buildings, and it's being mainly issued in advanced countries or upper middle income countries. This is not exactly an instrument that fits every type of activity, firm size, risk projects, countries, risk profile. So there are challenges for adapting or finding different instruments to fund this transition. The same for carbon pricing. Of course, we know that for carbon taxes and carbon pricing, there are opportunities for countries to increase revenues. And also from carbon markets, there are opportunities for raising resources to invest, to use for investments in different types of projects, including biodiversity projects. We know that. And we also know that there are some constraints of carbon markets that recently has been addressed or has been trying to be addressed with foreign and commercial policy instruments like the European carbon border adjustment mechanism, a discussion on carbon pricing international floor. However, there's still, we feel that there's still something missing to cover all type of activities in different countries. We actually need innovative solutions, and I see that in this conference, we can hear some innovative solutions that are important in this panel as well. We see, for example, recently the tax reform in Chile and in Colombia. They are proposing environmental commodity taxes, or something new that could fit the realities of developing countries. We also see initiatives on environmental service payments or ecological fiscal transfers. But still, we still need to have the development banks, the sovereign wealth funds, climate funds to work together to think of different solutions. And also, that's the last line, regarding fiscal efforts during green budgets, so we can actually know what's in the government expenditures, government's budget regarding green investments. Regarding monetary and financial policy, because here I want to cover different instruments, first like fiscal policy and now monetary and financial policy. We also see that central banks and financial regulators are doing a big effort towards climate-related issues. Here's a list of some initiatives that central banks are taking place, are actually doing. Assessment of climate risks, requirement of climate disclosures, green criteria to adjust reserve requirements, lending quotas, green collateral frameworks. But even here, we still have the same questions. The first one, does these initiatives affect all type of environmental projects that you're interested in? All emitters projects that you're interested in. And again, it's all about climate and it's all about environment. We should consider environment as a whole. And here, in the next slide, I will present lessons from the case of Brazil years ago. There's probably room, and there's something that we can discuss here, to increase the use of credit restrictions for projects with negative impacts on natural capital. There is something that central banks can still do and expand. Also, helping changing credit costs for environmental friendly projects or initiatives. And why am I saying that? And here's the case of Brazil. I would like to share two conclusions. With this case, of course, this is the graph, but it ends up on 2018, and it shows the emissions per sector. And we know that emissions patterns in developing countries is sometimes a bit different of emission patterns of advanced countries, because it's not always the case that energy is the most important driver of emissions. In the case of Brazil, it's deforestation, it's the Amazon, and you can see here in the top the emissions associated with land use and forests, and also in the third category the emissions associated with agriculture, which has also to do with deforestation as well. But we also see that in 2009, and it's not new, but it's always important to share, so we can find new solutions. Something happened there in terms of policy and in terms of governance change. What did happen among other initiatives? First one that is not listed, the Amazon Fund, but also in terms of finance and monetary policy, credit restriction by the central bank for projects that were supposed to increase deforestation. So the banks were not allowed to fund anymore this type of firms. And it actually, and econometrics that showed that it actually impacted and benefited the emissions. In addition, mechanisms of blended finance. At that moment, it was not called blended finance. Actually, it was just an effort of mixing different instruments. So the country or the public banks could be able to decrease average credit costs for certain projects that had also social and environment benefits and efforts. So these are like two initiatives that are important for this effort, and they can be, again, in the agenda. finally, and here are some conclusions after my 10 minutes, I guess, or less. Green economic policy instruments have recently increased, and indeed opens perspective to adjust it for different type of projects, and we should put developing countries' demands and all realities in the agenda. So the instruments fit all the realities, and it has much to do with natural capital intensive investment. So we can ensure that the green financial flows move from infrastructure to other type of projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for a few questions. I think we'd like to take advantage of this opportunity to talk about, the changes, these shifts that are happening to adjust for different types of projects and the challenges related to that. Perhaps you could say a little bit more about, so the key takeaway around how we can use a combination of different instruments and open that up to new types of projects. So do you see a potential, for example, to aggregate sustainable development, community-led type projects in this type of instrument?
So that's indeed a big challenge to bring convenience not for the decision making, but for the markets in terms of making them receive resources, financial resources. Because when you're talking about like climate finance, we refer to investment in projects, and when we refer to conservancy, we actually refer to cash flow. So it's about keeping the communities alive, like the production activities alive in a rolling basis. It's not about having one project that have like 5 years and finish. So for the same time that keeping this community receiving flows, financial flows, is a challenge. It should be done in some.
I'd like to open it up to questions. Or comments.
One question. What do banks tell you about it? Do they like that they now have rules whom they may give credit and whom they may not give credit?
Yeah, I guess we should ask that for financial regulators. What we see is that ESG units at firms, they really enjoy the fact that the government is trying to leverage more resources for their activities, and they have a say in the board. They have a say at firms, and they know that the society is of course demanding this even more. So there's something that we must do and test, and that's what happened like 10 years ago, like 15 years ago.
It works now. Yeah. Okay. Now it's working. Okay. What I'm always in this field are very irritated about is the level of regulation you are faced with in the finance market. It's mostly, well, I would say, over-regulated market, and this, of course, keeps also a lot of innovation out, because the mindset of the regulators, in my opinion, is still rooted in the old analog roadmap, and I think this is really a huge problem in terms of innovation. I talked to a traditional banker, a German banker, and he said, "Hey, I'm so happy about it because it keeps new entrants out because they can't comply with its rules." And I think to work on the mindset of regulators is a very important issue, and I think very often not yet enough on the agenda in the process.
That's a very interesting point, and I also read a study last week, actually, in which the scholars they found out that when the bank is more exposed to carbon, they tend to be less innovative in terms of financing green instruments, green investments, and it makes sense as well. So it should be also expected in the efforts of changing risk analysis, risk evaluation, so banks should move away from fossil fuels. So that's a big challenge. You know, like that's probably something that we should put in the debate for the session and for the other speakers. You know?
It's not really avoiding greenwashing, because a lot of the products out now are just on the outside green, but if you scratch a little bit, you realize it's the same old stuff and it's not doing any good for the nation.
Any more questions?
I think that speaks to the narrowing lens that we're seeing, especially with a digital agenda. And I think that's something we can also talk about. There's a dual element to blockchain emerging technology, the measurement impact, and what we're labeling as green and able to count as green. And I'm wondering also what that means for natural capital intensive economies where the digital infrastructure may not exist to the same extent. And other questions? Any other questions? Do you want a final word?
I completely agree.
Sorry, just one quick remark. So the graph you've shown about Brazil was quite impressive, and the drop in greenhouse gas emission linked to land use change is unprecedented, and in order of magnitude that is really significant. And what is striking me there is that there is no need for new investment regulation. To achieve that, there was no need for digital assets, there was no need for new technology, there was just need of a government decision or regulatory decision to make harming nature more expensive and to regulate the access to credit for that. And I think sometimes we get a bit distracted about where the real levies are and which is the amount of impact that each different kind of actions can bring.
I agree. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. That was a very interesting presentation. And just a little food for thought for a later discussion. I'd like to go directly to the next presentation and discussion with Rodolphe.
Okay. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you and online with you as well. What I'm going to try to talk about is about sustainable investment and to manage your expectations on what sustainable investment can deliver when it comes to protecting natural capital. I think that the clock is ticking. The clock is ticking very fast. We have limited resources, limited human resources, and limited investment resources. And the underlying question I want to ask is, where shall we put our efforts? To what kind of initiatives should we, on what kind of initiatives should we concentrate on? And is there a risk of being spread too thin? And how dangerous is it to get the feeling that we're moving forward because there is a lot of buzz around certain initiatives, where actually we're not moving forward at all, or we're moving forward much too slow. So what I'm going to talk to you very briefly about is, so there is a sustainable investment regulatory evolution that is unprecedented. It's also can be considered as a revolution. But then there are some dangers in the way it's unfolding, which are linked to the risk of trying to run before you can walk. And then I will talk to you about some players. So I'm working for one of them, which are sustainability data and rating providers that are feeding this assessment to investors so that they can allocate their capital accordingly. And the fact that they're becoming systemic players in the investment industry and the responsibility that comes with that new role. And then last, I had to find an animal that was not an elephant or whale, so I came up with a gorilla. And you will see that in the investment space, there are different asset classes. The largest one is sovereign bonds. And for some strange reason, it's one of the least tackled by sustainable investment. And we'll see that there are some disturbing reasons why. Wonderful. So, first thing you need to know is that the sustainable investment industry is driven by regulation. So on the left-hand side, you have a chart showing the number of new policy intervention in that field. And you can see it's been growing exponentially since 2010 and even more since COP21 2015. And you see that there is a great resemblance between the graph on the left-hand side and the graph on the right-hand side. And the graph on the right-hand side is the number of signatories to the UN PRI, Principle for Responsible Investment, and the assets under management they represent. So regulation is driving interest of investors when it comes to responsible investment. So it's not, it's a regulatory-driven market. I'd like to pause here for 1 second because on the right-hand side chart, you can see that the signatories of this Principle for Responsible Investment, they now represent close to 120 trillion assets under management. And I was looking at the chart and I asked myself, well, that's a lot. But how many assets under management are there in the world globally? And it's about 120 trillion. So what this chart says is that almost every asset in the world is managed under the Principle for Responsible Investment. And if that's the case, how comes that we are in such a situation and on the verge of environmental collapse? So I'd like to give a few answers to that. So coming back to regulation, I highlighted here a few of them that are really changing the landscape dramatically. So starting from the left, and as it was said earlier today, the European Commission and European Union is really leading the way there, trying to have a very holistic and comprehensive approach of the investment supply chain. So SFDR is about how investment solution providers are disclosing the sustainability of their investment products, and you can see that they need to disclose for a different fund category how they, which type of sustainability objective they are trying to achieve, and then to report on some principal adverse impact sustainability indicators. And you can see there, this is on the left-hand side, that a number of these principal adverse impacts relate to biodiversity. The taxonomy, which is the other big part of the EU regulation, is trying to set a common language on how to define green assets, starting with the climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, and then moving to biodiversity and ecosystems, and pollution prevention and control, which are the two new upcoming objectives. And then it's worth to mention also another one that is a bit less known, which is related to, but this is really a great evolution because if you've been to your bank already and if you have had the chance to have a bit of money aside to invest in the market, then your advisor in the bank has asked you what is your risk profile, what is your risk appetite, how much risk do you want to take with your investment? And that was mandatory, they're obliged to do so. And now, on top of that, they will be obliged to ask you about your sustainability preference. How much sustainability do you want to invest in, or to what extent do you want to take into account sustainability in your investment? So that's really a game changer because it changes the fiduciary duty of the person you're going to give your money to. So it's not only about giving you back some return on your money, but they will also have to account for your sustainability preference. So all of this is good. In France, very quickly, we have Article 29, which is requesting investors to report on the risk biodiversity is having on the profitability of their investment portfolio. And then we have regulators under the GFS that are starting to implement climate stress tests and even now thinking about the natural-related stress tests. So if you look just at the upper side, upper part of this slide, you would think, well, all of that is great. We're moving in the right direction, and you're probably right, but there are some strong limitations to that. And I come to it right now. So for the SFDR and taxonomy, investors have to report how they perform under SFDR on these principal adverse indicators and on the level of alignment of their portfolio with the taxonomy. The problem is that investors are asked do that before company report on these metrics. So investors have to report some data that do not exist because companies are not reporting them, and companies are going to report them in 2-3 year times when CSRD, which is the new corporate sustainability reporting directive, will start kicking in. So we are in a very strange situation where investors are being asked to report on some data that do not exist. So they need to rely on estimated data, on model data, and we'll see which are the risks related to that. For MiFID II, it's great to ask what are final investor sustainability preferences, but then you can say, well, yeah, I like to protect nature, but how does that translate into an investment strategy? And the connection between the two is not available yet. And all fund managers are scratching their head on how they're going to be able to deliver that to their fund clients. Article 29, reporting on biodiversity risk. I'm going to deep dive on that in 1 second, but there is a lack of data to do that. Once again, and there is no standardized methodology. So even if 3 different investors were doing that, they will probably do it with different methodologies so that the results will not be comparable. And then on the climate stress test, a natural stress test implemented by central banks. It's a good thing, but somehow it's delivering poor results for 2 reasons. The first one is that when you're doing a stress test of a bank portfolio, you're trying to capture some idiosyncratic risk. So how a given climate scenario is going to impact the performance of the loan of the bank. And banks that have been implementing their stress test, they find out that they're not exposed to climate risk. Actually, there is very little risk for them. And so this time, because they have short duration of their own portfolio, and they might not be that much exposed to climate. And to that extent, climate stress test might not be the right tool. And the right tool might be much more what João told us about, which is these banks, they're extending loan. In extending loan, they're not taking that much risk for themselves, but they are creating systemic risk. And we have to account for that systemic risk they're creating. And the right way to do so is to play with the capital adequacy ratio and the cost of capital for them. So moving to the next slide. Yeah. So biodiversity. So you can see here a chart that is highlighting the different organisms. Yeah. So that's everything that is needed to come up with an assessment of biodiversity impact of a company, which is eventually what you would like to communicate to investors. And the issue is that, so that's taken from some work of the World Economic Forum. You can see all the boxes that are surrounded by red. It's boxes where there is a very strong lack of data or a very strong lack of data. So you can see that all along this process, there are some missing data and huge uncertainties. And yet we are asking investors to take account of biodiversity risk. And the issue there is that some sustainability data providers or rating providers, are going to put out some, so all this complex workflow and data flow, the investors, they don't want to hear about it. What they want is a single metric, a single output of all of that, saying from A to E, is it good or is it bad? So there is a strong issue of forcing all this complexity with all these degrees of uncertainty into one single variable that is going to be used at scale by investors to communicate to final investor that yes, this fund is protecting biodiversity, or yes, it is at risk. And I'm going to give you an example which is linked to climate, which is to some extent much easier than capturing biodiversity. So sustainability data provider, they come up with this great idea to communicate about is a portfolio or a product or an asset aligned with the 2-degree target. So they will tell you if you invest in fund A, it's aligned with 2.75 degrees. If you invest in fund B, it's aligned with 1.75 degrees. So it gives you the feeling that, wow, my God, this is incredibly accurate and it's good. I'm going to invest in fund B. So how do they do that? One of the most prominent providers, they do that. They will have to figure out a way to estimate greenhouse gas emission of companies until 2050, right? Because they need to have a model way to account for the trajectory of the greenhouse gas emission of that company until 2050. And this most prominent climate data provider, the way they will do it is look at the trend over the last 5 years of greenhouse gas emission of that company, and just draw a line until 2050. And that's the level of complexity and robustness that lies beyond that 1.75 or 2.83 degrees alignment of your portfolio. So, unfortunately, there is little transparency about that, and absolutely no communication about the margin of errors of that key metrics that are now the backbone of sustainable investment industry. So I'm going to speed up because I think I'm way over time. Interesting point. So this sustainability data provider, sustainability data needs to be everywhere. You've seen the regulatory evolution that are weighing on investors. So there's been a study by the EU that was undertaken in January 2021, and that has found that the sustainability data provider or rating provider business was characterized by lack of transparency, poor timeliness, low accuracy and reliability, strong bias, low correlation with the financial performance, high risk of conflict of interest, lack of materiality, and contextual understanding. So there seems to be quite a lot of room for improvement there. A bit earlier this year, there's been another study which was actually a consultation by the EU because sustainability data providers are becoming systemic part of the investment value chain, as I explained. So, an outcome of that consultation by the EU is that 84% of market participants consider that the market of sustainability data and rating is not functioning well, highlighting the same shortcomings that the study of 2021. So a number of regulators are thinking about regulating the sustainability data provider because they're a systemic part of the investment value chain. But sustainability data providers are not of that opinion. So whereas all of their clients, 84% of the market, thinks it's not functioning well, they say everything is well. So that's the publicly available answer they've made to the consultation. Everything is well and no regulation is needed. No, we don't need regulation because we're pure. We're a sustainability data provider. So we're going to come up with a nice voluntary code of conduct, and that will fix everything. So last part, very quickly. So you can see here that most of sustainable investment is focusing on public companies, listed companies. Two issues there is that listed companies, they are the largest one, the more complex one, and they are the one for which sustainable investment metrics reliability is the lowest. If you are a private equity firm, you invest in a startup, there are 30 employees, it's quite easy to understand what are the sustainability performance and sustainability issues. If you invest in Nestlé, before you get a good understanding of how good they are in the different dimensions with the supply chain, it's very hard. Not to mention that the public company, the largest one, they have the ability to pay for large teams internally to figure out how sustainability data providers are coming up with a score, engineer the score, and make sure that they will increase the number of women on board by 1% to make sure that they compensate for larger greenhouse gas emissions and get a better score. And the second part is that to get impact when you are a shareholder of a listed company, it's much more difficult than when you're investing in a smaller company. So to the very last point, one of the asset class, so moving to the next slide, please. So sovereign bonds. Very little sustainable investment is dedicated to sovereign bonds. And if you don't need to be a sustainable investment professional with 20 years of experience to figure everything is on that side. It's the largest asset class in the world, so if you are serious about sustainable investment, you will actively address this asset class. Sovereigns, as was mentioned by João, they set the fiscal and regulatory framework for their economy. We are asking private investors to take account climate risk, transition risk, but yet there are only 22% of global greenhouse gas emissions that are subject to a price signal. So how to account for risk, which from a financial point of view, just doesn't exist? And who has the ability to put that price signal on greenhouse gas emissions, if not governments? Sovereigns, they're also the largest issuer of green and sustainable bonds. So, because they're coming to the market and saying, well, I'm issuing this sustainable bond or this green bond, they should be held accountable for their overall sustainability policy and sustainability performance, which is not the case. Fourth point, we've talked about TCFD and TNFD. So great reporting framework. What is striking is that sovereigns, when TCFD was launched, sovereign and governments have specially asked not to be included in the remit of TCFD. So countries want companies to be held accountable, but they don't want to be themselves accountable about their climate performance and risk, which is completely crazy. And then natural capital should be recognized as a key component of the wealth of nations, which is something that has been discussed this morning as well, and is probably more natural than having triple accounting for companies. So that's what I wanted to share. And as a conclusion on the final slide, you see that, yes, there are great trends in sustainable investment. Regulatory regulation is making sustainable investment the new normal. Investors are trying to integrate climate change, but already consider biodiversity and natural capital at the new frontier of sustainable investment. But there are some key issues that will strongly limit the ability to deliver if we don't pay attention. I will not go through them again. That's what I've tried to address in that presentation, which was way too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think you've really outlined, the real-world actions, metrics, and data stalling points that we're at. And to me, this always speaks to how it is that the entire innovation around new emerging technologies and other investment formats are coming to the fore because there is sort of this stall and these hurdles that we have to tackle. I think we have time for one question before we move to the next presentation, if there's any burning comment or question. I see two, perhaps, short ones.
You mentioned all the regulations, improvement of the number of regulations for this industry. But as I see it, is this the regulation for the banks, for the investors to meet a certain level of targets concerning information, availability of good information? But what is the regulation about new kind of products, of finance products, which seems not to be that much evolved and is not increasing that much, because you are saying that the data providers and the rating providers, they are not regulated at all. That means that possibly the new products coming out are not regulated either.
Yeah, so several points very quickly. So some sustainability data provider, so they rate companies on the one hand, and on the other hand, they advise companies on how to improve their score. So there is some conflict of interest there, obviously, so that's an issue. Where the regulation has been really moving forward is to raise the bar on what has to be made to call a product sustainable. So in Europe, that has been a real progress. So under SFDR, the Article 9 products, which are the one pursuing an environmental or social objective, to meet that bar, it's like 4% of the available funds are eligible to Article 9 criteria. or the European Commission has also defined what are climate indices. Climate transition benchmark, Paris Solar benchmark, so that's also raising the bar. One thing that they have not done, if you think about, in Europe, there is a regulation for car makers. And every year, they need to demonstrate that the average carbon intensity of the car they sell is decreasing towards a certain target, because that's the pathway we need to follow. And the same could apply to the investment industry. Fund manager could be held accountable by regulation to demonstrate that every year the carbon intensity of the asset they manage is decreasing. But that's not part of the regulation.
Maybe just a sort of technical question. You were mentioning that for biodiversity risk to be included in investment decisions, you would need to condense biodiversity data into a single metric. And I'm inclined to agree with. Do you think that's even possible? And how would such a metric look like? How would one go about building those?
Yeah, so in the end, sustainability rating provider, they always try to manage to classify your performance between A, B, C, D, and E. But I think it's stupid. I think they should acknowledge their limitation, and I think instead of implementing very complex models with compounded uncertainties that make the output not usable for any kind of sound decision, there are ways to concentrate on other type of information that are much more robust and simple, because if you think about the sectors, so it's not so much about the risk exposure to biodiversity or the impact you can have about the UST, than about the way you manage it. So you know the companies that are likely to have a strong impact on biodiversity. So that's known. These sectors are known. Mining, food and beverages, etc., etc. What then you care about is how do they manage this risk? And you don't need input-output models to get that information.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we'll move on. This is food for thought for the next part of our discussion after the next two presentations. I'd like to move on to Takhmina's presentation right away and dive into yet another element of this very interesting topic. And this is one of my favorite issues to be discussing. So thank you.
So this is forward, this is backward.
Okay, and we can do it today.
Yes.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. It's a great honor to be part of this event among such prominent speakers. And so far I learned so much about sustainable investments, also the monetary and fiscal policies, and now I would like to share my experience in, let's say, on the other side of the coin. So let me introduce you to tokenization as a future of the natural capital, and why is it so important in terms of the mechanism that we have now. So what is tokenization, right? I will avoid all the cryptographic explanations because I'm not a developer, so I'll just put it into simple words that tokenization is simply the securitization of assets via blockchain. Simple as that. We create the real assets on a digital platform, which is called blockchain technologies, including the rights and obligations linked to the associated value. Right? So the real assets are digitalized, represented using the blockchain. Right here you can see the entire process, how it works. So for instance, we have the property, we have the diamond, we have the copper, we have whatever, gorillas or natural capital, whatever the national capital is. We run it through the ownership certificate, which is a smart contract that allows us to give it all the necessary data that is out there, right? The cost of the land, the price of it, the value, everything is stored securely and encrypted on the smart contract. So then, once that's transferred into the blockchain, so the smart contracts are created in the blockchain and the block is created, that's when the tokens are issued. So the tokens can represent the regulated financial instruments like equity, bonds, funds, but also tangible assets like real assets, natural resources, such as precious metals and forestry, right? And there are two types of tokens that could be created out of this process. There's fungible tokens and non-fungible tokens, right? And usually, when it concerns the property, it's a security token that represents the real assets. So what are the benefits of tokenization process, let's say? So there are many benefits of tokenization, some of which are faster processes through digitization, fewer intermediaries, obviously, that reduces the cost, and increased efficiency, and of course, the global portability. Those are one of the main, and then we have, I've also listed how, in terms of the percentage, right, 65% lower cost compared to traditional securities, 100% more transparent. That was one of the issues, that transparency is something that we lack these days, and then the transferability, right, previously illiquid assets can now be transferred easily anywhere worldwide. So this is something also quite important that gives us new asset, let's say, asset group, sorry, it gives us a new asset group that will be part of the economic system of the new future sustainable system. So now let's talk about the case studies. So first of all, before I introduce the case studies, I have researched and I've been also, let's say, part of one of the tokenization processes called of the precious metals. And that's what I represent here, right? The AGAO, which is AG for silver and AU for gold. And that process made me realize how important the tokenization is in terms of the whole new economic system that is coming through. So, case number one, we have tokenization of precious metals, and this is the gold and silver by AGAO. So their mission is to be a superior form of money by enabling economic freedom and preserving wealth. One concern about this specific case is that AGAO is a payment token, right? So they have a payment license, so to say. They're backed by allocated and segregated precious metals, so each token represents 1 gram of gold or 1 gram of silver. And the extensive use cases are medium of exchange, unit of account, and store of value. Very interesting, right? So their mission is clear. The next step what we have is better vision of the gold standard using blockchain technologies, and of course democratizing the access to gold, both as investment and as money. And no token can be created without the actual asset in their vault. Makes sense? I think it makes sense, right? But what I also discovered within my work with AGAO is that AGAO provides a reliable and sustainable alternative for countries with challenging economic situation by enabling the necessary conditions to trigger economic growth and development of a sound money system. So, moreover, it directly targets these 4 sustainable development goals, and which is based out of my research with AGAO on the report AGAO for Sustainable Development Goals. And how does it tackle these goals, right? By easing the access to international investments and innovations, and build the capacity to focus on sustainable growth and reduce inequalities because of the medium of exchange being because of being used as a medium of exchange and avoiding the, let's say, high exchange rates, high costs, and so on that comes along. So in very simplified mode, this is all thanks to tokenization, right? So we have access to gold, we can transfer it anywhere, anytime, instantly, easily, and it also allows, let's say, small and medium enterprises to leverage by utilizing gold as a medium of exchange. I know economists would be arguing with me because there's US dollar, there's euro, and all this, all other currencies that are the major ones in the world. But for the, let's say for Rwanda, for instance, when you're trading with the outside world, with international, let's say with an international market, you always have to go from your current currency to a dollar to euro and lose in between a huge amount in fees. And then that means the emerging markets and the developing countries are not winning on trade with Western world, let's say. This is one case. But then we have the next case, and which is very interesting, is tokenization of natural capital. So this summer, the Central African Republic have announced that they're going to tokenize their natural resources. And of course, we know why, right? Tokenizing natural assets could aid in global cooperation and the accurate pricing of natural resources. The tokenization in Central African Republic will be carried out by the National Digital Currency Initiative that is called Project Sango. And Project Sango is a natural, so this Project Sango been heavily criticized by the International Monetary Fund, by World Bank, but at the same time, Project Sango's website claims that the World Bank has approved a 35 million development fund for this project. What do you think is out here? There is potential in tokenizing the natural assets. There is potential in really utilizing the blockchain technologies. And also, despite all the, let's say, criticism that goes around blockchain technologies, that goes around Bitcoin or digital currencies, governments now have started realizing how much it is important to really invest in these new technologies and prosper out of this, right? Because nowadays, like already, many companies are using tokenization process. Tokenization's been there. Now the only thing is that enhance this, let's say, solution is the transparency which is given by the blockchain technologies. But of course, there are many challenges to it. But first, I would like to cover the potential of turning the natural assets into tokenized assets on a decentralized blockchain. And those are the potentials out there. So the transparency and uniqueness. So as companies and governments commit large sums of money to become a carbon neutral by investing in natural assets in faraway lands, it is crucial that these assets are in double spend. So then each asset group will have its unique transparent number and transparent code that will avoid the duplication. Second is instant access to global markets. So the borderless, permissionless transactions verified on chain will enable participants to participate in natural asset markets anywhere in the world. But moreover, natural assets are global and allowing people to participate in the global market. So that means us can also benefit from being able to invest in those assets and being able to be part of the system. Then, using it as a collateral, tokenized assets can be collateralized for use in lending, in insurance, stablecoins, and other on-chain financial products. So instead of tagging stablecoins to existing, let's say, financial products, currencies such as US dollar, a new stablecoin could be backed primarily by the natural asset. So it could go back to my first example of being backed by gold or silver. And then opening the third-party verification of asset quality. So this is something that is really missing, right? We don't know how to measure the assets. We don't, let's say, not knowing it, but we know how to measure it, but we don't have all the data to measure it. So that's where we can create the oracles that can help us to measure natural assets that are created equal and their quality is out there. Even though it changes over time, you know that there's third-party verification that allows and ensures the quality and value. So that means there is a third party that goes back to the data and verifies it every year and ensures that the value have not changed, or if it have increased, or if it has decreased, and it can also notify the, let's say, users and the investors in this scenario. So tokenized natural assets also have a great potential to become one of the largest crypto asset classes. Because now it's lacking. Like crypto, whenever you hear about crypto, you think of scam, you think of anything, but not something serious, right? Because you can't really hold it in hand. But when it is an actual natural capital, a national capital tokenized in the system, you know that it's linked to something that's also a crypto. So then there is a verification, there is a transparency, there is the documentation that proves how valuable the transaction was, how valuable the asset is. And it's all stored securely on a blockchain. So I believe the blockchain technology, when combined with the social power, trusted oracles for natural resources, and secure data, will unlock the true value of natural assets and aid in the resolution of the climate and economic crisis in the future. So this is my presentation, and I'm open for your questions. I try to keep it very short, so I'm here to answer your questions. Thank you.
I think there are a lot of strings to pull out of this because it really does speak to so much and how far we've come in terms of the conflation of blockchain, crypto, initial coin offerings. And when, what we're speaking to here are some really key elements for natural capital, which is valuation of assets, tangible or intangible. But what you're doing in your work is actually then linking that to not necessarily fiat, but to an underlying currency of some sort. So there's a bit of flexibility in that, but still stability, which was lacking in the previous early models. Do you have any comments about the capacity of this to really scale up for developing countries?
Yeah, sure. I think the developing countries are the actual key, right, in aiding the future of sustainable economic development, right? So that's number one. And number two is the digitalization of, let's say, precious metals is not something new, right? It's not reinventing a wheel. It's just improving it, putting it on chain, and giving access to, let's say, new generation, to developing nations, to really leverage out of this. Because for so many years, it hasn't been the case. Like,
I have quite a skeptical question. I mean, if you tokenize and sell nature as assets, then you basically do the opposite that we should do. We should value and not sell nature. And basically, of course, you could say, well, we just sell the tokens, but the tokens have no value if they're not really connected with the underlying asset. So if you sell square meters from the moon, your tokens have no value because they are not really connected. So you need to connect them, and if you connect them, then what does it mean owning a part of nature, capitalizing on it, monopolizing it? And this is basically, I think, quite a slippery road.
Is this about collateral then?
Exactly.
Selling the asset?
Exactly. So this good question could be asked to the president of Central African Republic, right? Because when you go on their website of the project, you can now basically purchase the, first of all, it's the citizenship, right? When you go on the website, they tell you, you can purchase the citizenship, you can purchase the land ownership, you can purchase the forestry in terms of them digitalizing their natural capital. So they want the cash inflow, basically, for the moment, and then once the cash is in, they tokenize that cash and return the cash in, I think, 5 to 10 years. So the system is basically getting the revenue today and improving the infrastructure of the land, of the, let's say, the scale, whatever is being, let's say, put on chain, and then returning the investment, the initial investment to people, because they have already improved, they use the cash, they have improved the land, they have improved the infrastructure, so now it costs even more, so it can be sold for even higher price, right? And then they return the cash that's been initially invested. So it's not necessarily selling it, right? Maybe I would say that's also the collateralization or also renting it, right? So it depends on how you look at it.
Yes, in business model.
Yes,
Yeah. We have time for one more question.
Yeah, I guess my question is very related to the previous one. I'm sorry, I'm very curious about this, the technology from a very conventional industry, and who's actually taking the risk or sharing the risk of the assets?
Of the asset, like which case are you talking about? The case of precious metals or the case of the?
The case of precious metals.
Oh, the case of the precious metals. Okay, so when it comes to the precious metals, the risk in terms of having the asset or security of the asset?
Either.
Okay, so.
Financial risk.
Yeah, so no token can be created without an actual precious metal present in the vault, and the vaults are independently held at the outside of the, let's say, banking system. So it's not held in the bank, it's an independent vault where the money and where the precious metals are held. But there is a third-party audit that comes through to check if the, let's say, the number of tokens are equal to the number of precious metals in the vault. So this would be the third party who takes the risk and the security, so gives the security to the investor that the precious metals exist.
Thank you. I know we have a lot of questions, but maybe we have time for a very short one, because Marianne's been very patient with us. We'd like to get to her presentation, and then we do have time for another discussion. And I also see some comments there about the carbon footprint blockchain, which I think we can address later. That's about the conflation of the proof of work versus proof of stake, and then the regulation issues of blockchain. I think these are items that we can move to the general discussion, but if there's an urgent question about this right now, happy to take it.
No, I just see a little conflict of interest because traditional banks, they make their money with who's getting their fees from the deals, like with precious metals. And I already see the traditional banks queuing in front of the European Commission and creating pressure to intensify regulation. So I'm not really sure if this is going to work, because the decentralized model is very compelling, but also very hard to get to work.
Just quickly, I'll say yes, you're right. It is one of issues of the regulations and regulatory concerns. But I believe that already many banks have switched, right? So, there are many Swiss, but there's at least a couple of Swiss banks that also issue digital precious metals, let's say, right? So I think we're getting there, right? We might not be still there, having in terms of the acceptance rate at the governance level, but things are going to change eventually, right? That would be my answer.
Thank you. I think we're going to have some great discussions after the session. Thank you very much. And I think this, we can break it down also to some of the elements that have been discussed previously, is that capturing of data about an asset, tangible or intangible. There's the financial element, but there's also the proof element, right? The measurement and the efficiency element. So all of these sort of are stacking up into new business models, and that I think is the key here, is that not all of this is going to fit into a traditional financial system, and that is a part of the point of our discussion today, is to talk about the new business models that are emerging because of certain challenges and barriers. And I think that's a perfect segue into our next speaker, Marianne Haahr. So thank you very much. So Marianne, thank you so much for your patience, and very happy to have you with us virtually, if not in person. I'd like to pass the mic over to you. We have the slides here.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, thank you so much. And it's been fascinating to listen to you. And don't worry about me being patient. I think it's the perfect structure, because I will bring in data and tokenization into my presentation, which was already presented earlier. Because over the next 10 minutes, and I'll take 10 minutes, we have time for discussion. I will share reflections with you on how data and tokenization can potentially be leveraged as a tool to value nature in finance. So next slide, please. And really the rethinking of how nature is valued, and especially how policymakers and market participants have had a very narrow approach to valuing nature. That rethinking has already started with the launch by IPBES of their value assessment report recently. They started to introduce a new type of value typology. It offered categories of values that you see on the slides, and it also showed that policymakers and market participants have only used one of the categories of valuation of natural capital in financial markets, which is the specific valuation or the more extractive values, which is the foundation upon which most of capital market infrastructure is based, if it accounts for nature at all. So IPBES introduces a potential shift from looking at very narrow values of nature to looking at multiple values of nature and how it, and that shift in the underlying value system will also provoke a shift, or will need a shift in how we design financial market architecture and infrastructure. Stock exchanges today, they are set up to be able to represent the value of companies, some of which derive their value from dependencies and effects on natural ecosystem services, which are to a large extent not reflected in the share price. So in the introduction of new company listing category has actually started on the London Stock Exchange, where there now is a listing category for natural asset companies. And that does reflect a specific economic view that these companies are those that generate or monetize ecosystem services. So it does reflect that we are beginning to explicitly recognize by a financial market infrastructure monetization of ecosystem service as a value creation mechanism. But this listing category is still really based on the same set of specific values of biodiversity and ecosystem services valued by the economy. It's not a shift in the underlying value system. So today I would like to share a few reflections on how tokenization and data can help to support a redesign of the architecture of the financial system using digital technologies to be explored further. Next slide, please. And for this purpose, I would like to use the food sector as an example. It's the second, as you see on the side, it's the second most material sector as a driver of nature loss. And what are the material impacts and dependencies on food production that we need to decouple from? To answer that, financial service institutions and corporate can leverage open source data platforms such as the Anchor platform. And you see an example of the output on the slide, which is that you will get to know what are your materiality ratings of the main production processes for an agricultural company that it's dependent on. That could be pollination or soil quality, or the highest rated impacts, such as land conversion or pollution when it comes to agriculture. I mean, regulators are starting to, in a number of jurisdictions, to really create more incentives to change financing of these impacts. For instance, the EU new deforestation law on deforestation-free commodities, and also the mandatory due diligence regulation coming out of both the UK, the EU, but also starting in the US. Now, these types of regulation are really increasing the demand and therefore also hopefully the value of data coming from high impact sectors, such as the food sector. Next slide, please. So if we look at the first different type of value typologies that IPBES report introduced, it is the value of knowledge from biodiversity. And to create incentives to assess and embed nature impact of imported raw materials into, for instance, a jurisdiction like the EU, such as by the new deforestation commodity regulation. We need data furthest upstream of the agricultural value chain, which today is a very opaque value chain where you need to go up to tier 10 to actually get the actual geolocation of where that commodity came from and what were the nature related impacts and dependencies of that commodity production. So now we could either turn to ESG vendors, as we also heard in an earlier discussion. That's going to take a very long time to get this asset level data from the actual impacts of the commodity flows into big listed companies. Or we could look at ways that we could leverage tokenization. Tokenization to really redistribute value of data, also furthest upstream the value chain, and incentivize the farmers that are really interfacing with nature, and to a large extent also they're having to create the impacts and dependencies, to also become data vendors in addition to becoming farmers. So we could offer agricultural or farmers upstream, they could benefit from using data tokens where they, at the same time as they harvest their crop, they also harvest the data around the geolocation of where that crop is harvested from. So just geotagging where they're harvesting it, uploading that to a shared ledger, in return getting a data token and automated payments for that data. So a data token could incentivize the collection and input of data on commodity geolocation of origin, and also with time layering in embodied nature impacts. So data tokens can be rewards for millions of farmers who harvest crop as they harvest the data. And that could be a result that could support the agricultural commodity value chain and could be a way to value the knowledge of farmers. So bringing in tokenization to really tokenize the knowledge on the commodities and paying for that knowledge to the farmers with data tokens. That could be ESG data providers bringing in and tokenizing this new type of value on nature. Next slide, please. So specific values, that's one of the second categories of IPBES, and that's the type of value on nature that we are most used to. It's what we heard in the other presentation around specific value is the transactional value that we create on nature. But if we have this type of information, so through these data tokens, where you can actually geolocate the actual commodity and the nature and embodied nature impacts of that commodity, it's actually possible then to start to look at how to issue transition-linked tokenized or digital bonds to these farmers. Because either as listed bond on alternative marketplaces, or the data can be leveraged to design nature-linked supply chain finance, linked to nature performance of the most upstream parts of the agricultural value chain. Just like we're seeing it for carbon these days, the same could be done through tokenized models for nature. And interest rate rebates could be linked to the main nature-related risks identified by a large food company, such as soil fertility or deforestation impacts. And data tokens can thereby play a new role to shift incentives. And with time, that could not only provide suppliers with real incentives to shift to nature-related targets, but it can also help to embed more nature-related goals throughout supply chains. Next slide, please. This is the third value set or the value of nature that IPBES is putting into their typology. And it's called relational or utility values. Now, there's a lot of talk these days about the metaverse, and all of us, and especially younger generations, spending a lot of time in gamified worlds. But really, that is around creating relations, and that's where we think mostly about these non-fungible tokens, that you can have a non-fungible token in a gamified universe. But we could also shift from using data tokens, as we talked about, to value knowledge, to valuing relations with nature, and using tokenizations to represent that relation with nature that we hold. So in the metaverse, people get these very immersive experiences and ability to merge virtual and physical worlds, and that offers opportunity to gain access to utility, to relational values with nature. This can be in the form of a non-fungible token that can offer access to outdoor recreational activities in the real world, linked to recreational experiences in the metaverse, or a governance token that can give voting rights into the management of a natural area, or it can be NFTs that are replica, as we see currently out there, of species, of endangered species, or just species that you meet in the metaverse and that you can also meet out in the real world. And that these, if people want to pay more from them, can be traded on platforms like OpenSea. So these were just 3 ways of thinking about and bringing into the workshop reflections on how can we use data and tokenization to think about and to start to tokenize new value systems around nature. So it's not only the extractive specific values that is part of most policy and most financial market thinking, but it's also the knowledge on nature, and it's also the relations on nature or the ecosystem services from nature. Thank you so much for listening.
Really interesting. I'm unmuted. Thank you, Marianne. Can you hear me? Yes.
No, she's muted.
She's muted. Okay. I think you touched on some really interesting factors, and something that pops to mind, that this idea of being able to leverage local knowledge is a really interesting factor, especially in natural capital universe. And A part of that, though, is around what I call the 3Gs, the divides that we're seeing happening. So how can we ensure that we have generational, geographic, and groups of stakeholders, as well as gender, included in this, in remote areas where that type of local knowledge is really important to get access to internet, perhaps just using smartphones. I'm assuming that there's some sort of interface that can be created for that to happen.
Yeah, I think you touch on a really important point because, well, there is almost, what is it? There is, I think, 2 smartphones per person in the world, right? So more people have smartphones than bank accounts and toilets, and we've heard that many times, right? So, but it is true that in a country like, for instance, that we heard about before, Central African Republic, it's actually only 10% of people that have access to the internet, right? So we do need to start with these approaches and making these inclusive data models where we actually enable people to monetize some of their knowledge around nature, to start to do that in environments and jurisdictions where you have the proper infrastructure to do so. So of course, going to the poorest and most remote country to trial this may not be sort of the first way to do it. But I do think that if we start to trial some of these models of really tokenizing, local knowledge, which is where most of business is interfacing with nature, is really upstream value chains, then I think it could have a more, putting people more at the center of this nature transition. But it's true, there are some jurisdictions and for some remote areas where this is still part of a future.
I think this is also where we have to ensure that we're not reinventing the wheel, but we can leverage existing models, microfinance, local models, etc., things like Hive Online, which could be integrated into this type of model that are already doing sustainable agriculture and gender inclusion, etc. Would that be something that you could build into the models that you're working on?
I think a lot of these mobile platforms that we have seen scale really quickly in a lot of these emerging markets, they are looking at, how can they create greater value to their users? And I think the green value is sort of the next step for many of these. I mean, we are seeing some of them going out to do automated carbon scoring of their SME clients, etc., leveraging the data that they have. So I think some of these mobile payment platforms would be definitely interested in looking at how can they create shared value with their users. It can be some of the telcos, MTN, others that could be quite interested in going for these models, because if they first start to offer a shared value model where you have a small scale farmer offering geolocation data and embedded nature data on a crop that they're exporting, palm oil or another crop, then that data can also then be packaged to offer them microinsurance, index insurance, other products. So I think it can really be a collaborative innovation between the users and the mobile payment providers, which could be an interesting innovation.
Sorry for the pause, we're having to mute and unmute. No, I think that's really interesting because another part of the dialogue that's happening around this is scalability of innovations, when instead we could actually be looking at layering and amplifying existing initiatives and amplifying and layering those up into new models, up and down value chains and in a more inclusive way. But I want to open up now to the rest of the people here and the experts in the room for any additional questions or comments.
Thank you, Marianne, for the presentation. Just curiosity comes to my mind because there are several different actors involved of different types and sizes. When it comes to agriculture and agricultural industrial structure, you have like big groups, large supply chains like small farming, have like informal activities. How to deal with these different actors and information collection?
Yeah, it's a really good point. The agricultural value chains are very fractionalized, right? And it depends on where you are in the value chain, how you can actually do the data capture. If you're a large listed company today, to get access on all your supplier data furthest upstream is almost impossible, right? So there is definitely some of these initiatives definitely will need to look at what are the aggregators in the value chain. So these are the refineries, or it's the mills, it's the traders. That would be those that would be able probably to aggregate, or to be those that also need to play a role in the work. And it would probably need to be, if you go through a mobile payment provider, I think all of the actors in the value chain would need to see some benefit in it, or at least participate in it, because otherwise it will be too difficult to implement. So it really needs to be sort of a test on a whole value chain approach. I think that's a really good point. And we are seeing quite a number of the large listed companies going this way, right? We are seeing, for instance, Unilever, or some of the bigger ones that are currently trying to estimate where their supply shed, the farmers are geolocated, because it's so difficult that they just, draw a radius around the mill. They use satellite data and they estimate approximately where are they sourcing from, because they don't have the information. And some of these listed companies are starting to look at and leveraging geolocation data from cell phones, etc., to get a better visibility of the geolocation of their assets further up the value chain. So there is a lot of innovation going on, and a lot of thinking and willingness, especially with the new regulations embodying deforestation, with commodities being banned in the EU, etc. That's putting pressure on the large players to get access to this data, and quicker than the market will necessarily release it.
I have a question on, are there been any kind of estimation or studies about the computational power it will require to have this data token for all commodities? Because
yeah.
So you want to have this data attached to each grain of rice, each grain of wheat, each barrel of oil, whatever we extract or produce from the earth. So we can see the benefit of that, but what will it cost in terms of computational power to have it for all commodities? Has someone looked into that?
I think you can probably use some of the calculations that's been done, but it depends on, in terms of what is the energy use of different blockchains, right? But this one would not necessarily need to be. I mean, the really big energy use, of course, in the blockchain space is where you have these consensus algorithms, right? Where you have to have a transaction being verified by all nodes in a system, which makes them very inefficient, highly secure, but very inefficient. This would not be built on these types of more sort of old AI models in blockchain. Of course, you would need to have some of those that are much more energy efficient. You would need to build it on something like a consensus algorithm, right? You could use a much lighter footprint algorithm. And then I totally follow you to say it's very ambitious, right? So rather start with those commodities that we know are high impact on nature. So start with those and then get it to work, and then build in data layers as we go. And then of course you will need to just as also is regulation in the EU now, right? You would need to disclose what's the energy usage on it, but it wouldn't need to be a very sophisticated blockchain that needs to be verified.
If I may say something, of course you don't put this data on a blockchain. This is not state of the art. You put it somewhere else, and you just put a hash on the blockchain. So there is practically no additional energy use
for the data or very little. And you were talking about the kinds of data that you could use, and of course data has a lot of value, but a lot of data has a lot of value. Little data has often almost no value. So if you collect a little bit of data about a plant, this is not worth a lot. But if you have a lot of data about plants, about plant growth, etc., you can do a lot of research about it. And I'm wondering what kind of data you were thinking of. You were talking about gender about, we were talking about plants. So gender of plants or gender of farmers, or what is connection that you had in mind?
Yeah, so here we're really thinking about its data on asset geolocation, as we also heard earlier, of some of the high-risk commodities, those that have the highest impact on nature. So to start there, because that's where the biggest demand is from the market, driven by regulation currently. So really start with that. And then, of course, you can build on other types of data points, but really the geolocation is key, because that's what investors cannot get a hold of today. And aggregate that. If you have that in a digital format, you can much easier aggregate that. And then layer in the highest impact. So we start with the commodities that are deforestation risk exposed, for instance, because that's where the regulation is now being put in place by the EU, right? And then you go to other of the major drivers of biodiversity loss, since we know that 80% of biodiversity is in tropical rainforests, right? So you go, and we know exactly the 5 commodities that's deforesting in the Amazon, etc. So you start on those commodities because those will have the biggest impact. So that's where the data will have the biggest impact and where there's currently the strongest demand. Currently, there's little demand necessarily for other nature drivers, but this is where the biggest demand is currently.
So I was just also saying that, within this panel, we're talking about investment in financial institutions, but the broader discussion is also about the Capitals Coalition, the valuation of nature, of social and economic elements as well is really important. And so if we're supporting cooperative agriculture, where gender is a big factor in terms of the Human Development Index, it may not be a top investable project, but by layering that up, there are elements of that can become data point to prove impact in other ways. And I think that's part of the narrow scope that we tend to get into. We tend to focus down into the specific commodities and assets and the financial instruments. And to me, this is also a discussion about other types of funding and investment architecture that's being built out to support different types of projects. So Marianne, I'm not sure if you have something to add on to that as well.
Yeah, I fully agree that for those that are furthest upstream the value chain, so those that really normally farmers that are interfacing much closer with nature are the ones that find it most difficult to attract capital, right? They're on local bank financing or microfinancing, etc. But if they start to build these data tokens and actually start to build a track record and a history that they own on their phone, then they are in a much better position, and it's much easier to aggregate them across and issue aggregated loans, which will make it more attractive for development finance institutions, for other types of financial actors. But we need to start somewhere, and right now there's a big data demand for this type of data, where we could look at innovative models, which will then, I fully agree with you, Katherine, which will open up new types of financing. It can be green linked, or it can just be with a better track record, so the risk assessment can be for access to cheaper capital, etc. So I fully agree with you, but the way in could be the data side.
I also just wanted to say, thank you to Denise online, who's also talking about the values for humanity to protect nature. quality of crops of farmers, clean water, etc., soil. So there are other factors within the natural ecosystem as well, where we may not be able to capture data in terms of the ecosystem service per se, but it is really sort of a more robust question that we have to attend to. And I also wanted to say to Michelle, who's got some points about blockchain up there, we can take that offline, but again, it's about the carbon footprint of blockchain, but this is again about the proof of work, proof of stake, the underlying technology and platform that you're using, and most working in the impact fields are using the energy efficient one. But I think you had a final comment that you wanted to say as well.
Yeah, it was basically, in general, when it comes to blockchain and innovative technologies, I think it's all about the joint work, collaboration between one another. That's the main purpose. Also what Marianne said, right? The collaboration between the payment platforms with the data collecting platforms, because this is the new generation that creates this new type of economy, and we need to take care of the nature, we need to take care of the carbon footprint, we need to take care of the so many, let's say, essentials that haven't been thought about before, that needs to be included in the tech, into the tech, but also into the consideration under economic and political integrations. So definitely, Marianne, I would love to get in touch with you and discuss possible collaborations on this side. And yeah, so those.
And if I can add a little comment, I'm into data protection, and when I hear this kind of data collection, which is probably personal data, I have some kind of stomach pains, but I don't know.
But we were talking about the nature data.
Yeah, I think
we're talking about gender data. So
no, again, I think there are AI tools and others that we're using in these types of projects that are looking at different types of data that is accessible without issues of privacy. And this is actually part of blockchain technology, is being able to provide data inputs that are more aggregate rather than specific. And here it doesn't actually hold data on the chain, it holds a transaction. And so that transaction relates to the measurement and aggregation of data points. And in terms of accessing, in terms of data privacy and ethics, I mean, this is something that a lot of us are working on, is to ensure the ethics of what's happening in terms of emerging technology and the models, etc., but also in terms of what's happening globally in terms of the investment approach. Because I think part of the risk that we haven't talked about here is the fact that the focus on emerging technology could have the opposite effect if we're not very careful about how and when we layer up these models, that we could actually end up having a much more narrow lens on what is impact. So I'm afraid that we have to close the discussion. I want to thank everyone for their amazing presentations and interventions. Marianne, I wish you could join us for coffee and dinner afterwards, but I'm sure we will continue having this dialogue with you in various formats and forms. So thank you everyone very much for your inputs.
Thank you.